The city was drenched in a gentle drizzle, the kind of rain that made the streets glisten and umbrellas pop up like colorful flowers. Inside the small cafe on the corner of Elm Street, the warm, golden lights reflected on polished wooden tables, casting a comforting glow over the few patrons who had escaped the rain. The smell of cinnamon, coffee, and freshly baked pastries filled the air, creating a sanctuary for anyone who needed a brief escape from the outside world. Sophie adjusted the strap of her worn shoulder bag and tugged the hood of her light jacket over her head. In her other hand, she held the tiny hand of her 5-year-old son, Ethan. His small sneakers squeaked on the wooden floor as he stepped carefully around puddles that had followed them inside. Sophie couldn't help but notice how the cafe, usually crowded and lively, now seemed like a peaceful refuge from her hectic day. She glanced around for an empty table. Most were occupied, groups of friends chatting softly, a couple sharing dessert, a man in a tailored suit typing away on his laptop in the corner. Sophie's heart sank slightly. Carrying her son in bags, it was nearly impossible to maneuver without bumping into someone. Ethan tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, can we sit somewhere?" he asked, his voice small but hopeful. Sophie scanned the room again, feeling a mixture of embarrassment and desperation. Then her eyes fell on the man in the corner. He was tall, well-groomed, and completely absorbed in his laptop. A plate of fries sat beside him, half-eaten, and a cup of coffee steamed gently in front of him. Sophie hesitated for a moment. Asking someone to share their table was always a little awkward, but she had no choice. The cafe was too full, and Ethan was hungry. Taking a deep breath, she approached the table. "Excuse me, sir," she began softly, unsure if she was interrupting. The man looked up, his sharp blue eyes meeting hers. For a moment, Sophie felt a pang of nervousness. There was something striking about him, not just his appearance, but the calm, confident energy he seemed to radiate. "Yes," he said politely, his voice smooth and steady. Sophie smiled nervously. Would it be okay if we shared your fries?" The man blinked, then a small, amused smile curved his lips. "Of course," he said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Please have a seat." Relief flooded Sophie's chest. She guided Ethan toward the chair, and he climbed up eagerly, his eyes lighting up at the sight of the fries. "Thank you so much," Sophie said, lowering her voice to a whisper. "It's just been a long day." "I understand," the man replied softly. "Rainy days can be like that." He pushed the plate of fries slightly closer to Ethan, who giggled and began picking up the golden, crispy fries one by one. As they ate, Sophie felt a warmth she hadn't realized she was missing. There was a simple kindness in the man's demeanor, an unspoken generosity that made her heart feel lighter. "I'm Sophie," she said after a moment, feeling a little braver. "And this is my son, Ethan." "Daniel," he said, extending a hand in greeting. "It's nice to meet you both." Ethan, unbothered by formalities, waved shyly. "Hi," he said, crumbs dotting his lips. Daniel's eyes softened as he looked at them. "Hi, Ethan. Those are some serious fry-eating skills you've got there." Sophie laughed softly, a little embarrassed by her son's enthusiasm. "He gets that from me," she admitted. "I guess we've both been craving something simple today." The conversation was light, punctuated by Ethan's questions and innocent observations. He asked Daniel about the laptop, about the coffee, even about the rain outside. Daniel answered with patience and genuine interest, making the little boy giggle with delight. Sophie found herself relaxing, the tension of her day melting away. It was rare, she realized, to meet someone so unpretentious in a city that always seemed to demand appearances. And yet, here he was, smiling gently, sharing fries, asking questions that made her feel seen, not judged. When they finished, Daniel reached into his wallet and left a small note on the table. Sophie picked it up curiously. Written in neat handwriting were the words, "Your smile brightened my day." "Daniel." Sophie blinked, a warm rush of emotion flooding her chest. She looked at Daniel, who simply nodded, still watching Ethan with a kind expression. Ethan tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, he's nice," he said, his voice full of certainty. "Yes, he is," Sophie whispered, her heart softening. She didn't know why, But something about this stranger felt important. Like the start of a story she hadn't expected to be part of her life. As they left the cafe and stepped back into the rain, Sophie held Ethan's hand a little tighter, thinking about the kindness of a man who had shared not just fries, but a moment of warmth. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a tiny, hesitant hope began to grow. What if this chance encounter was the beginning of something beautiful? The following days passed in a blur for Sophie. Life had a way of demanding every ounce of her attention. Work deadlines, household chores, grocery runs, and caring for Ethan. Yet through the mundane routine, her mind kept drifting back to that rainy afternoon at the cafe. She remembered Daniel's calm smile, the way he had laughed at Ethan's silly questions, and that small note he had left behind. It was strange, Sophie thought, how a simple act, sharing fries, could leave such a lasting impression. She found herself smiling at random moments, imagining Daniel looking over his laptop, patiently answering her son's curiosity with a gentle kindness that felt almost unreal. Ethan, too, seemed to have made a connection with Daniel, even in the short encounter. "Mom, I hope we see Mr. Daniel again," Ethan said one evening as they ate dinner. "He's nice. I like him." Sophie chuckled softly, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Me too, Ethan. Me too," she said, though she reminded herself to stay realistic. Daniel was a stranger. He might never cross their path again. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. A week later, Sophie found herself back at the same cafe, this time seeking a brief escape from her own worries. Rain tapped gently against the windows, creating a comforting rhythm that matched her quiet mood. She clutched Ethan's hand as they stepped inside, scanning the room with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. And there he was, Daniel, in the same corner, the sunlight behind the rain, making the steam from his coffee look like a halo around him. He looked up as Sophie approached, and for a moment, their eyes met. "Hello again," he said, his voice warm and welcoming. "It's nice to see you." Sophie felt her cheeks flush. "Hi, Daniel," she replied softly. "I wasn't sure I'd run into you again." Daniel smiled, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "I come here often. It's one of the few quiet spots in the city. I'm glad our paths crossed again." Sophie felt her heart lift. There was something comforting about the familiarity in his voice, a reassurance she hadn't realized she needed. She guided Ethan to the empty chair, and they settled in. Over the next hour, conversation flowed more naturally than Sophie expected. She found herself talking about her daily struggles, not complaining, just sharing the reality of her life. Daniel listened attentively, nodding, occasionally asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. Ethan chimed in, his innocent curiosity bringing laughter and light to the table. "Why you type on that thing all the time, Mr. Daniel?" he asked, pointing at the laptop. Daniel chuckled, lifting Ethan slightly from his chair so he could look at the screen. "I run a company," he said simply. "I make sure everything works smoothly. It's like a big puzzle that never ends." Ethan's eyes widened. "Wow, that sounds like a lot of work." "It is," Daniel admitted, smiling. "But today, meeting you both, it feels like the puzzle just got a little brighter." Sophie felt warmth spreading through her chest. There was no pretense in Daniel's words, no hint of arrogance or condescension. He wasn't impressed by her life or intimidated by it. He simply seemed present. And that presence, so rare in a bustling city, felt like a gift. They lingered in the cafe until the rain eased into a light drizzle. Daniel suggested a small walk to the park nearby. Sophie hesitated for a moment. She didn't want to impose, but Ethan's excited, pleading eyes made the decision easy. The three of them strolled through puddles, Ethan splashing gleefully while Daniel held his mother's hand lightly, careful not to intrude, but close enough to show he cared. They talked about simple things, favorite ice cream flavors, little adventures from childhood, the funny quirks of city life. Sophie noticed how naturally Daniel seemed to fit into their little world. It wasn't just kindness. It was attentiveness, the way he remembered small details about Ethan, the way he laughed genuinely at the boy's silly jokes. It made Sophie's heart ache a little with hope and a little with fear. Could someone like him really care about someone like them? At the park, they stopped near a fountain. Daniel leaned casually against the railing, watching Ethan throw pebbles into the water. "You have a remarkable son," he said quietly to Sophie. "He's bright, kind, and full of joy. You should be proud." Sophie felt tears prick her eyes. Compliments like that were rare, especially when they came from someone she barely knew. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice catching. "I try my best. Some days it feels like that's all I can do." Daniel's gaze softened. "You do more than try. You love, and that's what matters. The world could use more people like you." Sophie smiled, feeling a flutter in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. Perhaps it was the rain, the warmth of the moment, or Daniel's quiet, steady presence, but something about him made her feel safe. As the sun peeked through the clouds, casting golden light over the fountain, Daniel turned to her. "I hope this isn't too forward, but I'd like to see you both again. Maybe not just here in the cafe, but somewhere quieter, somewhere we can talk more." Sophie hesitated, cautious yet drawn to his sincerity. "I like that too," she said finally, smiling. Ethan clapped his hands excitedly. "Yes. Can we have ice cream next time?" Daniel laughed, ruffling Ethan's hair gently. "Ice cream sounds perfect." As they walked back toward the cafe to return to their separate lives, Sophie felt a spark of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. It was small, fragile, and uncertain, but it was real. And sometimes, that's all it takes to begin a story worth telling. After that rainy afternoon, life slowly returned to its usual rhythm for Sophie. The hum of the city, the chaos of work deadlines, and the endless responsibilities of raising Ethan alone consumed her days. Some nights, she would sit by the kitchen window after putting Ethan to bed, sipping a cup of tea, and allow herself a small smile at the memory of Daniel's calm presence, the shared fries, and the walk in the park. Ethan, for his part, seemed unusually cheerful that week. "Mom, when will we see Mr. Daniel again?" he asked one morning as Sophie packed his lunch. Sophie hesitated. "Soon, honey. Maybe this weekend," she replied cautiously. She didn't want to make promises she couldn't keep, but part of her secretly hoped the universe would align to bring him back into their lives. Meanwhile, Daniel returned to his world, a fast-paced life filled with boardroom meetings, phone calls, and luxury offices that seemed a world apart from Sophie's modest apartment. He moved among people who often admired his success, but rarely saw the real man behind the wealth. And yet, in the quiet corners of his mind, he found himself thinking about Sophie and Ethan. It wasn't just a passing thought. It was persistent, gentle, and quietly insistent. He remembered the way Sophie's laugh sounded, soft and unpolished, but genuine. He recalled Ethan's curiosity, the way his eyes sparkled when asking questions, and how Daniel had felt an unexpected warmth when the little boy giggled at his silly responses. One evening, Daniel found himself alone in his office, the city lights twinkling like stars outside the window. He pulled out the small note he had left at the cafe and reread it, almost as if hoping it would provide clarity to the emotions he couldn't quite name. "Your smile brightened my day." It had indeed brightened his day, but more than that, it had lingered, refusing to fade. He realized that in a life filled with schedules, obligations, and superficial encounters, Sophie's kindness had been a rare and authentic connection. For Sophie, the weeks passed with a mixture of routine and anticipation. She went about her work, did chores, and navigated the endless challenges of single motherhood. Yet, every time she walked past the cafe or heard the rain tapping against her window, she found her thoughts drifting back to that day. She imagined Daniel typing on his laptop, his calm demeanor unshaken by the bustle around him, his eyes softening whenever Ethan made him laugh. There were moments of doubt, of course. Sophie reminded herself that Daniel was a stranger, a man from a world so different from hers. He was clearly successful, confident, and perhaps unattainable. She questioned whether someone like him could ever truly care about someone like her, a single mom with a life that was far from glamorous. Yet, despite her doubts, there was a small, persistent hope that wouldn't leave her. It was the kind of hope that lingered quietly, tucked into everyday moments, the warmth of a shared smile, the echo of a laugh, or the memory of a simple act of kindness. One afternoon, Sophie decided to return to the cafe, not knowing whether Daniel would be there. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the afternoon sun. She clutched Ethan's hand and walked inside, scanning the familiar warm interior. To her relief, she saw him sitting at the corner table, focused on his laptop, a cup of coffee steaming beside him. Daniel looked up as she approached. "Hello again," he said, his voice carrying the same warmth that had stayed with her all week. Sophie smiled a little shyly. "Hi, Daniel," she replied. "I didn't know if I'd find you here." "I come here often," he said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "It seems our paths are meant to cross." As the afternoon sunlight shifted through the cafe windows, casting long shadows on the floor, Sophie felt a subtle shift within herself. She wasn't just enjoying the moment. She was beginning to imagine a life where moments like this could exist more often. Moments where kindness, laughter, and genuine connection mattered more than appearances, status, or wealth. And for Daniel, the feeling was mirrored. He realized that what drew him to Sophie wasn't just her charm or Ethan's innocence. It was the authenticity of their lives. No pretenses, no masks, no carefully curated personas. Just real people sharing real moments in a world that often overlooked such simplicity. As they parted that day, promising to meet again soon, Sophie couldn't help but glance back, catching Daniel's eyes for a fleeting moment. There was something unspoken in that look, a shared understanding, a gentle acknowledgement that this encounter was more than chance. Walking home with Ethan, Sophie felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. The spark she had felt on that rainy day had grown, subtle but undeniable. She didn't know what the future held, or if Daniel's world could ever truly intersect with hers. But for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope. Sometimes, she thought, life had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. And perhaps, just perhaps, this stranger who shared his fries with her son might be the beginning of something extraordinary. The city streets shimmered under a soft drizzle as Sophie pushed open the cafe door, her thoughts a jumble of work, errands, and Ethan's endless energy. The smell of fresh coffee and baked pastries wrapped around her like an old, comforting blanket. She wasn't expecting to see him again, not so soon, but as her eyes scanned the room, they landed on the corner table. Daniel sat there, his posture relaxed, laptop open but idle as he sipped his coffee. He looked up, and for a moment, their eyes met, and the world seemed quieter, as though the city's noise had dimmed just for them. "Hi, Daniel," Sophie said, a shy smile tugging at her lips. "Hello, Sophie," he replied, his voice warm, steady. "I was hoping I'd see you again." Ethan tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, it's him. Can we sit?" "Of course, honey," Sophie said, leading him toward the empty chair. As they settled in, Daniel's smile softened, his gaze flicking between mother and son. "It's good to see you both. How have you been?" Sophie felt her nerves ease in the comfort of his attention. "Busy, tired, but good," she admitted. "Ethan keeps me on my toes." Daniel chuckled. "I can see that. He seems full of energy and curiosity." He glanced at Ethan, who was already examining the sugar packets on the table like a scientist studying specimens. Ethan grinned. "I like figuring things out." Daniel leaned closer, his interest genuine. "I like that. Curiosity is a wonderful thing. It helps you discover new things, see the world differently." Sophie felt a warmth in her chest she hadn't expected. It wasn't just that Daniel was kind. He was thoughtful, patient, and genuinely engaged with her son. Most people didn't take the time. Most people didn't notice. As they shared fries once more, conversation flowed more naturally than ever. Sophie found herself telling Daniel little stories about her childhood, funny mishaps, small victories, and the lessons she had learned along the way. Daniel listened intently, occasionally smiling or laughing softly, never interrupting, always engaged. "I think you're doing an incredible job, Sophie," Daniel said at one point, his voice gentle. "Raising a child alone isn't easy, and yet you manage it with grace. It's inspiring." Sophie's cheeks warmed. Compliments like this were rare, especially from someone she barely knew. Thank you, she whispered. It means a lot. Ethan tugged at Daniel's sleeve. Can we go to the park after this? There's a big fountain, and I want to show you how high I can throw pebbles. Daniel smiled and ruffled Ethan's hair. Lead the way, young man. Outside, the drizzle had softened into a gentle mist. The park glistened with puddles and dewy grass, reflecting the soft afternoon light. Sophie watched as Daniel knelt down beside Ethan, letting him show off his skills with laughter and playful encouragement. Daniel didn't dominate the conversation. He joined in, matching Ethan's energy without overwhelming it. Sophie couldn't help but notice how natural he was with them. There was no pretense, no attempt to impress her or her son. Just simple, genuine interaction, the kind that made her heart feel lighter than it had in years. As they walked back toward the cafe later, Daniel slowed his pace to match Sophie's. I hope you don't mind me saying this, he began carefully, but I really enjoy spending time with you both. There's something refreshing about it. Simple, honest, real. Sophie glanced at him, her heart fluttering. I feel the same, she admitted softly. It's nice to just be ourselves without worrying about anything else. Daniel nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. For the first time, Sophie sensed a connection that went beyond polite conversation or fleeting kindness. It was subtle, gentle, and tender, a spark she wasn't quite ready to name yet, but one that made her hope for more. As they parted that day, Daniel's eyes lingered on Sophie and Ethan for a brief moment, longer than necessary. Until next time, he asked, his tone light but sincere. Until next time, Sophie agreed, her heart warm. Walking home, Sophie felt a quiet excitement bubbling within her. There was something rare about Daniel, something kind, thoughtful, and genuine that she hadn't encountered in years. And though she knew little about him, any little about her, she couldn't deny the tiny spark of anticipation for the next encounter. For Daniel, the feeling was mirrored. He returned to his office later that evening, glancing at the small notebook he kept for personal thoughts. He scribbled a quick note to himself. They feel real. This is different. I want to see more. And so, the bond began to deepen, not through grand gestures or expensive gifts, but through small moments, shared laughter, and the quiet understanding that sometimes the simplest connections leave the most lasting marks on the heart. Days turned into weeks, and Sophie found herself thinking about Daniel more often than she had expected. Not in a way that distracted her from life or responsibilities. Her days were still full of work, errands, and caring for Ethan, but in quiet moments, when she and Ethan shared a laugh over breakfast or walked home from school, she would remember the way Daniel's eyes had softened at Ethan's questions or how gently he had guided them through that first rainy encounter. Ethan, naturally, was enthusiastic about every meeting with Daniel. Mom, when's Mr. Daniel coming again? Can we go to the park? He'd ask, bouncing on the balls of his feet. Sophie found herself smiling at his eagerness. The boy deserved happiness, companionship, and the kind of care Daniel offered effortlessly. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel invited them for a small outing. Not a grand, extravagant event, but a casual trip to a nearby ice cream parlor. Sophie hesitated briefly. It wasn't that she didn't want to go. She simply wasn't used to people including them in their world. Most people didn't bother to take notice of a single mother and her young son. But Daniel's invitation felt genuine, warm, and thoughtful. Come on, Ethan, Sophie said, taking his hand. We're going to see Mr. Daniel. Daniel greeted them with his usual calm smile, holding the door open for Sophie and Ethan. It's good to see you both, he said, motioning toward the colorful ice cream counter. Which flavors are we trying today? Ethan's eyes lit up at the array of colors and toppings. All of them, he exclaimed with uncontainable excitement. Daniel laughed, letting the boy point to a few flavors. Sophie smiled at the sight, noting how patient and attentive Daniel was, not just with Ethan, but with her as well. There was no pressure, no expectation, only kindness, laughter, and a shared joy in the small moments. After they had chosen their ice cream, they found a quiet bench nearby, the city bustling around them but somehow fading into the background. Daniel watched as Ethan carefully balanced his cone, making sure it didn't tip over. "You're very careful," Daniel said. "A little like your mom, I guess." Sophie laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I try," she said, feeling the warmth of his observation. "But sometimes life doesn't leave much room for careful steps." Daniel's gaze softened. "I see that. And yet, you handle it all with grace. That's remarkable." Sophie felt her cheeks warm, not for vanity, but from the sincerity of his words. It was one thing to receive compliments from strangers. It was entirely different when someone truly seemed to see her, not just her struggles, but the way she navigated them with quiet resilience. Over the next few hours, they walked through a small park, watching children play and enjoying the crisp afternoon air. Daniel didn't dominate the conversation. Instead, he listened, asked gentle questions, and laughed at the little things that brought joy. Sophie found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. She talked about her dreams, the little things she wished for Ethan, and even her fears about balancing life alone. Daniel, in turn, shared glimpses of himself. Not his wealth, not the glamorous life that often defined him publicly, but the man beneath, someone who valued honesty, compassion, and the small joys that made life meaningful. Sophie was surprised by how grounded he seemed, how much his presence felt like a safe harbor in her otherwise unpredictable world. Ethan, oblivious to the subtleties of adult emotions, tugged at Daniel's hand. "Come play on the swings," he shouted, his laughter ringing like bells through the park. Daniel obliged, pushing Ethan gently, letting him soar higher with each swing while Sophie watched, her heart swelling with warmth. She realized, in that moment, that she trusted him, not fully, perhaps, but enough to feel comfortable letting him be part of their lives. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting golden light across the park, they sat on a bench together, eating the last of their ice cream. Daniel turned to Sophie quietly. "I hope you don't think I'm overstepping," he said, his tone careful. "I just enjoy being around you both. There's something honest and refreshing about our time together." Sophie smiled softly, touched by his words. "I feel the same," she admitted. "It's rare to meet someone who doesn't judge or complicate things unnecessarily." Daniel nodded, as if relieved. "Good. That's exactly what I hoped you'd feel. I never want you to feel pressured, just comfortable with me." Sophie looked at him and felt the first gentle flutter of something more than friendship. She wasn't ready to name it yet, but she sensed a connection that went deeper than casual acquaintance. There was trust forming, slowly but steadily, built on kindness, shared moments, and genuine care. Walking home that evening, Sophie held Ethan's hand tightly. "You like Mr. Daniel, don't you?" she asked quietly. Ethan nodded vigorously. "I do. He's fun, Mom. And he likes me." Sophie laughed softly, feeling the same warmth reflected in her own heart. She realized that this trust, this friendship, might be the foundation of something much more, a life where laughter, kindness, and love weren't just dreams but possibilities. And Daniel, in his own world, returned home that night with a quiet smile. He thought of Sophie and Ethan and knew that whatever the future held, he wanted to be part of it. Not because of appearances, not because of obligation, but because they had touched something in him he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging, of genuine connection, and a growing warmth that promised more than either of them could yet imagine. The weekend arrived with the kind of crisp sunshine that made the city streets sparkle. Sophie and Ethan had been looking forward to another casual outing with Daniel. It had become a comfortable rhythm, simple, joyful, and unpretentious. They didn't need fancy dinners or lavish experiences. Just a shared laugh, a walk in the park, or an ice cream cone was enough. Ethan bounced excitedly in the back seat of Sophie's modest car. "Mom," he said, "we might go to the aquarium today." Sophie smiled at his enthusiasm. "Looks like it's going to be a fun day," she said, though a small part of her felt apprehensive. She didn't know much about Daniel's life beyond the moments he shared with them, and part of her wondered what else lay behind the calm smile and gentle demeanor. When they arrived, Daniel was already waiting near the entrance, casually dressed, but with a subtle elegance that Sophie had noticed before. His warm smile lit up his face as he waved at them. "Hi, you two. Ready for an adventure?" he called out, bending slightly to greet Ethan with a high five. Ethan cheered, running to him eagerly. "Yes, let's see the fishies." Sophie followed, trying to relax, enjoying the familiar comfort of Daniel's presence. As they moved through the exhibits, Daniel's genuine enthusiasm for the animals, combined with Ethan's excitement, created a lively, joyful atmosphere. He wasn't showing off or trying to impress. He was simply engaged, present, and fully enjoying the moment with them. They wandered through the colorful tanks, watching schools of fish glide like ribbons of liquid light. Sophie noticed how naturally Daniel interacted with Ethan, asking him questions about what he saw, encouraging him to explore, and laughing at the little jokes only a child could make. It was when they stopped near a large, shimmering tank filled with exotic fish that things took an unexpected turn. Daniel's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. His expression flickered for a brief moment, not with annoyance, but with sudden focus. He excused himself quietly and stepped aside to answer. Sophie and Ethan continued observing the fish, unaware of what was happening. But minutes later, a familiar sound, the faint click of cameras, caught her attention. A small group of people, holding cameras and microphones, appeared nearby, whispering excitedly and pointing toward Daniel. "Is that?" Sophie began, her voice catching. She followed their gaze and saw Daniel stepping back toward them, speaking calmly, but the reality hit her like a sudden wave. Daniel wasn't just a kind stranger or a regular man enjoying a day at the aquarium. He was a public figure, recognized by the press for his role as the CEO of a major corporation. A quick glance at one of the cameras revealed flashing headlines. Tech billionaire Daniel Whitman spotted with mystery woman and child. Sophie's heart sank. She felt her face flush with embarrassment and confusion. Ethan looked up at her, puzzled. "Mom? What's wrong?" Sophie knelt beside him, trying to compose herself. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just someone knows him, that's all." Daniel returned, his calm smile unchanged but with a subtle concern in his eyes. "Sophie, Ethan, I'm sorry about this," he said softly. "I didn't plan for anyone to see us today." Sophie's mind raced. All those simple, heartfelt moments, the shared fries, the walks in the park, the ice cream outing, they suddenly felt complicated. Did he really want to spend time with them? Or was this part of some public persona he was careful to show only in controlled moments? I didn't know," Sophie said, her voice trembling slightly. I thought you were just you." Daniel reached for her hand gently. "I am me. Always. But I understand if this feels overwhelming. I wanted my wealth to be irrelevant to our connection. I didn't want it to define us." Sophie's chest tightened. She felt a swirl of emotions, confusion, hurt, doubt, but also a lingering trust that had grown over weeks. Daniel wasn't trying to hide behind wealth to impress her. He had actively chosen not to reveal it, not because he was ashamed, but because he wanted her to see him for who he was. Ethan tugged at her sleeve again. "Mom, it's still Mr. Daniel, right? He's still nice." Sophie looked at Daniel, who knelt to meet Ethan's gaze. "Always," he said softly. "I care about you both for who you are, not because of anything else." Sophie's eyes softened. She wanted to be upset, to feel betrayed, but the sincerity in his words was undeniable. She realized then that the bond they had formed, the shared laughter, the quiet moments, the trust, wasn't about money or status. It was about kindness, authenticity, and a growing connection that could withstand surprises. Taking a deep breath, Sophie smiled, though it was tentative at first. I understand," she said, her voice steadying. "It's a lot to take in, but I see you. I see who you really are." Daniel's relief was visible, a soft smile spreading across his face. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That means more than you know." For the rest of the afternoon, Sophie and Daniel continued their visit to the aquarium. The press and cameras eventually drifted away, leaving them to enjoy the exhibits together. Ethan's laughter echoed through the halls as he pointed out his favorite fish, and Daniel's gentle encouragement made Sophie feel the warmth and ease they had shared before the revelation. Walking home later that evening, Sophie reflected on the day's events. She realized that trust was not about ignorance. It was about seeing someone truly, understanding their intentions, and believing in their sincerity. Daniel's wealth had surprised her, yes, but it hadn't changed the person she had come to know and care for. Daniel walked beside her, his hand brushing lightly against hers. "I hope I didn't make this day feel complicated," he said softly. Sophie shook her head, smiling. "No, it was unexpected, yes, but it didn't change anything important. You're still you, Daniel, and that's what matters." As they approached Sophie's apartment, Ethan ran ahead, giggling. Sophie watched him go, feeling a sense of peace. Despite the shock of discovering Daniel's world was far more complicated than she realized, she felt confident that their connection, built on kindness, shared moments, and growing trust, was real. Sometimes, Sophie thought, life surprises you in ways you can't predict. And sometimes, the surprises only make the connection stronger. Daniel looked at her quietly, the afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the city streets. "Thank you for trusting me," he said softly, almost more to himself than to her. Sophie met his gaze, her heart swelling with warmth. "I do," she said simply. "I trust you." And in that moment, the small spark that had begun with shared fries in a rainy cafe grew brighter, stronger, and more certain. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew one thing for sure. The bond they had formed was real, and it was worth holding on to. The days following the unexpected revelation of Daniel's wealth were a mixture of reflection, emotion, and quiet anticipation for Sophie. The initial shock had faded, replaced by a growing understanding of the man she had come to trust. Daniel's sincerity had been clear from the beginning, but now Sophie found herself seeing the depth of his intentions. It started with small gestures. One evening, Daniel showed up at Sophie's apartment with 2 takeaway meals, carefully chosen to match her preferences. He didn't make a show of wealth or lavishness. There were no extravagant gifts or ostentatious displays, just thoughtful actions that made Sophie's heart warm. "I thought you might be tired after work," Daniel said gently, handing her one of the bags. "I wanted to make things a little easier tonight." Sophie smiled, touched. "That's very kind of you, Daniel." "Thank you." Ethan peeked from the living room, eyes wide. "Is it pizza night?" "Yay!" Daniel chuckled and ruffled Ethan's hair. "Exactly. Pizza night with your favorite toppings." That night, the 3 of them ate together, laughing over small jokes and stories. Sophie noticed how naturally Daniel fit into their little family, how attentive he was to Ethan's needs, and how he made her feel seen without any pressure or expectation. In the following weeks, Daniel continued to show his care in subtle but meaningful ways. He helped Sophie with errands, accompanied Ethan to soccer practice, and even joined her for quiet evenings at home, bringing little surprises like a new storybook for Ethan or a flower he'd picked himself. Every gesture, no matter how small, spoke volumes. One rainy afternoon, Sophie found herself overwhelmed with work and household chores. Ethan had a school project due, and she was struggling to manage both at the same time. Daniel appeared at the door, holding an umbrella and a small bag of supplies. "Thought you might need a hand," he said, smiling warmly. Sophie felt tears prick her eyes. "You didn't have to," she said, though her voice trembled with gratitude. "I wanted to," Daniel replied simply. "It's not about what I have or don't have. It's about helping those I care about." Together, they tackled Ethan's project, laughing at the boy's imaginative ideas and encouraging him as he worked. Sophie noticed how patient Daniel was, how genuinely he engaged with Ethan's world without condescension or distraction. For the first time in a long while, Sophie felt completely supported, seen, and safe. As the weeks turned into months, their bond deepened. Daniel didn't rush or push for romance. Instead, he nurtured trust and friendship, allowing Sophie to open her heart at her own pace. Sophie found herself looking forward to their moments together, not out of obligation, but because being with him felt comforting, joyful, and right. One evening, as they walked through a quiet park after a simple dinner, Daniel stopped and looked at Sophie with a soft, steady gaze. The city lights reflected in his eyes, making them appear almost luminous. "Sophie," he said quietly, "I know we haven't known each other long, but I want you to know you and Ethan mean more to me than I can put into words." Sophie felt her chest tighten. She wanted to speak, to reassure him, but words failed her. Instead, she simply nodded, feeling the warmth of his sincerity. Daniel continued, gently taking her hand. "I know I've surprised you with my life, and I understand if it feels complicated, but I need you to know this. My feelings for you and Ethan are real. Nothing else matters as much as you two." Sophie felt tears well up, not of sadness but of overwhelming emotion. She realized then that she had been allowing herself to hope, to feel, to believe in something she hadn't dared to imagine in years. A family, a partnership, a love built on trust and care. I feel the same, Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I trust you, and I care about you too." Daniel's relief was palpable. He smiled, a slow, genuine expression that reached his eyes. "Thank you, Sophie," he said softly. "That means everything." Ethan, who had been running ahead, suddenly returned, tugging at both their hands. "Are we a team now?" he asked, grinning. Sophie laughed, brushing tears from her cheeks. "Yes, Ethan, we're a team." Daniel nodded, his gaze warm and affectionate. "The best team," he said. In the following days, the three of them shared quiet, heartwarming moments. They baked cookies together in Sophie's kitchen, laughed at Ethan's imaginative stories, and spent lazy Sunday afternoons reading in the park. Daniel's presence was steady and comforting, and Sophie found herself opening her heart fully, not just to him, but to the idea of a life where love and family could exist without fear or hesitation. Sophie realized that trust had grown into affection, and affection had begun to blossom into love. Not the dramatic, whirlwind kind that appeared in movies, but a gentle, steady, and enduring connection that promised warmth, joy, and stability. And Daniel, in turn, understood that true wealth wasn't in money, possessions, or status. It was in the moments shared, the laughter that echoed through a park or a kitchen, the quiet understanding between two people who had chosen to see and care for one another fully. As they walked home one evening, Daniel reached out and held Sophie's hand, intertwining their fingers naturally. Sophie didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed gently, a silent acknowledgement of the trust and love that had grown between them. For the first time in a long while, Sophie felt completely at peace. Life had been unpredictable, challenging, and full of hardships, but in Daniel, she had found kindness, love, and the promise of a future built on trust, laughter, and shared moments. And as the city lights twinkled around them, reflecting in Ethan's excited eyes, Sophie realized something profound. Sometimes the smallest gestures, a shared fry, a gentle smile, a moment of patience, could grow into something extraordinary. Daniel smiled at her, sensing her thoughts. "You know," he said softly, "I think this is only the beginning." Sophie returned his smile, feeling her heart swell. "I think you're right," she whispered. And in that quiet, heartwarming moment, the foundation of a love story, gentle, enduring, and real, was firmly in place. The city streets glowed under the soft light of a late afternoon sun, and Sophie found herself walking hand in hand with Daniel and Ethan, a quiet happiness settling over her like a warm blanket. Life had been a whirlwind, full of unexpected surprises, moments of doubt, and challenges she hadn't anticipated as a single mother. But somehow it had led her here, to trust, love, and the possibility of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. Ethan bounded ahead, laughing as he chased a pigeon, his small sneakers slapping the pavement. Sophie glanced at Daniel, whose eyes followed her son with a gentle, protective warmth. She had grown to understand what Daniel had meant when he said he cared about them, not as obligations or curiosities, but as real people with hearts to protect and nurture. "Mom, look," Ethan called, holding up a fallen leaf. "It's shaped like a heart." Sophie smiled, her heart swelling. "It is, isn't it?" she said softly, brushing her fingers across the leaf. Daniel leaned closer, his expression tender. "Perfect for a little team like ours," he said quietly. Sophie felt a wave of warmth. "Team," That word, simple yet profound, encapsulated everything she had come to know about Daniel. He wasn't just a friend or a companion. He had become part of their lives, a constant source of care and support. The day continued with quiet joy. They visited a small bakery, picking out pastries for an impromptu picnic in the park. Daniel carried the basket carefully, smiling as Sophie and Ethan debated which treats to choose. There was no grandeur, no showiness, just laughter, shared decisions, and the simplicity of being together. As they spread a blanket under a large oak tree, Daniel watched Sophie as she helped Ethan open a pastry. "You know," he said softly, "I've never been happier than I am in these small, ordinary moments with you and Ethan." Sophie looked at him, her eyes reflecting the sunlight and a mixture of emotion she couldn't fully put into words. "I feel the same," she admitted. "It's real. Not complicated, not pressured. Just us." Daniel reached for her hand, holding it gently. "That's exactly how it should be," he said. "We don't need anything else. I want to build a life with you and Ethan, one full of small joys, laughter, and love." Sophie's chest tightened. She had dreamed of love before, but it had always seemed distant, unattainable, or fleeting. Yet here was a man who had shown her, time and again, that love didn't have to be dramatic or conditional. It could be quiet, patient, and enduring. Ethan tugged at her sleeve, bringing them back to the present. "Can we feed the ducks now?" he asked, eyes sparkling. Daniel laughed, scooping him up gently. "Absolutely. That's part of our team duties, isn't it?" Sophie chuckled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. Watching Daniel with Ethan, the way he engaged with him, encouraged him, and made him laugh, was more meaningful than any extravagant gesture could ever be. She realized that the life she had once feared she couldn't have, a life with love, partnership, and joy, was now within reach. Later that evening, as they walked home, the city lights casting a soft glow on the wet streets, Daniel paused and looked at Sophie. "I know we've had a few surprises along the way," he said gently, "and I know that my life isn't ordinary. But I promise you this, everything I do, everything I am, is for you and Ethan. You are my family." Sophie felt tears prick her eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming love and certainty. "I trust you, Daniel. I believe you," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions coursing through her. Daniel smiled, a quiet, heartfelt smile that seemed to reach into the very core of her heart. "Then let's take the next step, together," he said softly. Sophie nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement, peace, and hope. She realized that love wasn't about perfection or grand gestures. It was about consistency, trust, and shared moments that became memories. Daniel had shown her all of that, and now she was ready to embrace it fully. Ethan yawned suddenly, leaning against Daniel's leg. Sophie glanced down, smiling. "Looks like our little team needs a rest," she said softly. Daniel laughed, scooping Ethan up once more. "Resting is part of teamwork too," he said, winking at Sophie. As they reached their apartment, Sophie felt a deep sense of completeness. The uncertainties of the past, the struggles, the hardships, the fear of being alone, had led her to this moment. She looked at Daniel, her heart full, and realized that together they had created something rare and beautiful, a foundation of trust, love, and family. Inside, they settled into the cozy apartment. Daniel helped Ethan into pajamas while Sophie prepared a small cup of cocoa. The evening was quiet, filled with soft laughter and gentle conversation. Sophie noticed how naturally Daniel had become part of their lives, how seamlessly he had integrated into their little family. Finally, as Ethan fell asleep in his bed, Sophie and Daniel sat together on the couch. Daniel reached for her hand, holding it tightly. "You've changed my life, Sophie," he said quietly. "Not because of anything I've done, but because of who you are. You've taught me patience, love, and the beauty of simple moments." Sophie leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling a sense of warmth and belonging she had never experienced before. "And you show me that love can be real, consistent, and gentle," she whispered. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the soft hum of the city outside blending with the quiet rhythm of their hearts. Sophie realized that life, with all its unpredictability, had given her a gift far greater than she could have imagined. A chance to love, to be loved, and to build a family grounded in trust, laughter, and unwavering care. As Daniel held her hand and she leaned into him, Sophie felt a sense of certainty. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a team. And in that knowledge, there was peace, joy, and a love that promised to endure. The journey that had begun with shared fries in a rainy cafe had grown into something extraordinary. And now, as they looked toward the future, Sophie, Daniel, and Ethan were ready to embrace it fully, together. And so, what began with a simple question, "Can we share your fries, sir?" turned into a story of trust, love, and the little moments that make life extraordinary. Sophie, Ethan, and Daniel showed us that true connection isn't about wealth or appearances, but about kindness, honesty, and being there for one another. Sometimes, the smallest gestures can change your life forever. Remember, love can be found in the simplest of moments if you just open your heart.